Hi guys, Mr. Edmond here again, and today what we're going to do is we're looking at another social group in the 1960s and 1970s in the United States that started to protest with what rights they were not receiving as American citizens, and that would be Native Americans. We've discussed this before and how Native Americans in the history of this country have been treated. And in the 1960s and 70s, just like with the civil rights movement, just like with the Latino movement, you start seeing Native Americans really, this is a different type of a message, though. This type of message, instead of for full blown equality that we might have seen in civil rights and Latinos, this is more of a movement about uh, basically not really leave us alone, but kind of give us what we deserve and what we've deserved all along. And you really see that come out in some of the movements that start happening in the 1960s and 70s. In the 1950s, under President Eisenhower, that you see here, in 1954, he signed something called the Termination Policy. And if you can see this chart here, you'll see that in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, what you're looking at here is the amount of Native Americans that were being forced into urban cities. And if you think about the suburbs being built in the 50s, and you think about white flight in the 50s here, and then you go from white flight, where the suburbs seem to be the new white middle class, and then you look at the 60s and 70s, you see that again, another minority group is being added into the urban setting, into the cities. And of course, the cities in that time period in these decades saw a lot more poverty. And so this again was seen kind of as a tipping point that you're forcing us once again to come into an area to basically be poor and to get rid of the reservations. And so because of that, what you start having in the 1960s is, by the time you get into the 60s, in 1961, there was a document called the Declaration of Indian Purpose that was released. And the Declaration of Indian Purpose, actually, if we go back to this slide, was against the termination policy. It was basically, this needs to stop, this needs to end. And yes, they purposely called it the Declaration of Indian Purpose to make it sound like the Declaration of Independence, to get our attention. And so off of that, what you had in the 1960s, as the 60s moved forward, once President Johnson came in after John F. Kennedy had passed away and been assassinated, in 1968, the National Council on Indian Opportunity was formed under the leadership of President Johnson, basically to address problems that Native Americans were facing in this country. In addition, you see this flag here, and you see the peace symbol. If you can kind of see the peace symbol here, it's a hand and a peace symbol. If you didn't see that as you were looking at it, the basically AIM is formed in this time period, and this is the American Indian Movement. It was formed at first to protect Native Americans against possible police brutality. It sounds a lot like the Black Panthers that we saw in the Civil Rights Movement. And their goal was basically to get their own rights, to have their rights too in this country. And that led in 1972 to a march on Washington called the Trail of Broken Treaties. If you think about all of the treaties that we have talked about during the school year with Native Americans and all of the things that were promised and not delivered, that's kind of where you went with the 1972 March on Washington by Native Americans. And you can see here, as Native Americans are setting up their protest, you have the Washington Monument in the background. So basically, what happened? Did anything good come of this? Well, yes. In 1972, you had the Indian Education Act that was formed. And basically what this is going to do, paired with the 1975 Indian Self-Determination and Education Act, is you start having Native Americans be placed more in charge of their own destiny, their own future. Reservations are still around today. And the ability for Native Americans to still have a say in the education of their children and not necessarily be assimilated as we have seen so often in the past. So the other thing I want to draw your attention to here is the BIA on this sign. That was the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And in 1972, basically, Native Americans protested because guess what? The BIA was being ran by whites. And it just proved that if whites are running the Bureau of Indian Affairs, they're really not addressing the problems or looking to find people that can address the problems of Native Americans. So while this is still an ongoing thing in this country, and we're still trying to accept the fact that Native Americans really were here first and they have a right to their own self-determination, we see progress in the 60s and the 70s, much like the other groups. But this progress was a little different in the sense that it wasn't necessarily for equality, it was for self-determination.